We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is the head writer for the Doomberg team. How are you today, Doomberg?
Doing fantastic. Publication day, always a relief to get a piece out the door and to start thinking about the next one. And, I always really enjoy our conversations and really appreciate the opportunity to come back on.
Well, I always appreciate having you, and it feels almost surreal to be speaking with you on a day that there wasn't something extremely dramatic that happened right before. I mean, the last two times we spoke were very consequential, or seemingly consequential at the time, days where, we spoke right after the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline. We spoke right after one of the train derailments that, we've seen so much of recently. And, today there's nothing particular in the news to speak about, but I'm sure that won't be long.
Yeah, it's the East Palestine derailment was in fact what we spoke about last time. And, it is nice to have a breather from the continuing crises, but there's always interesting things to talk about and to write about, and so be it gold or nuclear or the energy crisis in general, and so there's the headlines are still very interesting. But you're right, this is the first time that I've been on the show where we weren't in the throes of a 24-hour panic news cycle. So in a way, I guess that's good.
Well, that's kind of part and parcel with the summer doldrums. And I agree, that's good. But at the same time, I'm apprehensive about what comes next, because it seems that there's so many plates spinning that are wobbling that, you and I can both see that pose major risks to the stability of society as we know it, let's say.
It's funny you should say that, because we have our monthly Doom Zoom scheduled for later this week, and the title is Doom Scrolling, Searching the Globe for Things to Worry About. And so it'll be a fun little presentation. We're just putting the finishing touches on it. And in fact, if you go looking for it, as we do as defensive pessimists, you can in fact find things teetering on the edge, whether it's potential kinetic conflict with China, maximum complacency in Europe with respect to energy, complete collapse of the wind industry, which we believe is coming, potential mayhem in the oil market. So there's no shortage of doom if you go looking for it, and then that's what we specialize in. And so it's going to be a fun presentation for the Doomberg Pro Tier later this week.
Well, that was something that was on my mind yesterday quite a bit, and it would be interesting to get your take on it. As you said, when you're constantly searching for bad news or negative situations, do you think that the proliferation of those ideas is more so driven by this industry that needs to keep writing about it, number one, and number two, the ability to be so connected all the time and the ease at which we can access negative stories in that way?
I would say both of those things are true, but I would add the concept of defensive pessimism is actually a known affliction of some people, and I'm the first to admit that I suffer from it, or I'm advantaged by it, depending on how you look at it. Mm-hmm. The concept of defensive pessimism is dwelling on worst case scenario risks, convincing yourself that you have a proper hedge and or abatement plan, and then you are liberated from such concerns to operate at a high level. And a lot of people do that subconsciously. You'll find the whole genesis of Doomberg was we were doom scrollers, right? And I think zero hedge, for example, is extraordinarily popular because it sort of gives you that little dopamine hit of clickbait. And there's some obviously very solid reporting and good distribution of other people's work through that platform. But the concept of Doomberg is, in fact, we are very optimistic people. We just spend a lot of time pondering against and hedging against long tail risk so that we can sleep a little more comfortably at night. And so that's the whole point of our presentation, in fact, is to ponder the consequences of those things and what we would do about it if such events were to arise. But there's no question that the proliferation of social media has made access to noise as readily accessible as signal, and people are hit with a deluge of noise, and it's very difficult for some to partition the signal from the noise. And then also, it is also true that I think Google and Facebook have ruined much of the reporting industry to the point where much of the sector has devolved into a clickbait farm exercise, selling toenail fungus ads against otherwise serious writing, which is why we went with the subscription model, and we write pieces that are long but worth reading, and try to sort of swim against that current and stand out. And so Doomberg, of course, is a bit of a cheeky name, and as I said, we're ultimately pretty optimistic, but we are the first to confess that late night doom scrolling has probably occurred a time or two on my laptop.
Well, thankfully we don't have to worry about that now in Canada. Seeing news pop up on our Facebook, whatever you would call that. I don't use Facebook anymore, but thankfully now with the new government censorship laws, we don't have to look at news anymore on our Facebook feed.
Yes, I believe it's called the news feed. Yeah, but I don't know because I'm not on Facebook either.
Yeah, but that brings up a bigger point about really looking at both sides of many of these stories. And that's something that is the goal of this podcast, and I appreciate from you as well, is really trying to dig in to the research behind some of these narratives and trying to look at these things objectively. And that's something I'd like to touch on a little bit later. But, maybe we could start with what this degrowth movement is, and is it a future that could be thrust upon us if we aren't, aware of the reality of the energy situation?
Yeah, great question. And then we wrote a piece on this exact issue. There was this amazing conference in Europe. I believe it was called Beyond Growth. and you would think that this would be a fringe movement, but in fact, as we described in the piece titled "Green is the New Red," no less than the president of the European Union herself kicked off the opening plenary to that conference, and it was really amazing to see. Just like the titles of the focus panels were so incongruent with our sort of form of capitalism and how we perceive economies are to be efficiently run, that it kind of opened people's eyes. There's like, it's literally programmed socialism with a desire to shrink the economy, and we're seeing already in Europe a backlash to this. Of course, in Germany in particular, with AfD surging in the polls, and we do believe, in fact, that the response by the European elite to the quote unquote hard right wing AfD party in Germany is likely to trigger what we would call the Streisand effect, where in their desire to suppress this political party, they're only going to cause it to become more popular with the masses. But one of the things we've tried to say to our friends in the environmental movement, for example, is that if you push too hard, too fast, and go down the wrong path, you will trigger revolt. You will trigger serious political upheaval, and I do believe we're going to see really amazing political eruptions here in Europe. I'd keep a close eye on the upcoming election in Spain, where it looks like the Conservative Party, thankfully a pro-nuclear party, looks set to win. But if you just go to this degrowth conference, there's 18 hours of excruciating, torturous footage available, and it was right in the heart of the European Parliament. Like, this was not, a couple of universities professors kicking around the hacky sack on the university lawn, daydreaming about what they would do if they were dictators. This is the actual leadership, the very top leadership of the European Union, openly describing their desire to shrink their collective economies. It is really insane.
And it's interesting to kind of see the pieces that are floated through the public eye that suggest that this is a good idea. I know you retweeted the other day if some blackouts would be good for the environment, if we should start accepting blackouts. And it always seems like, this is an idea that gets floated through the public consciousness, let's say, and then in some ways walked back, and then it doesn't seem as bad to what the reality of the situation is. Is that fair?
There is certainly a sense that they are laying the political propaganda mines ahead of abrupt changes to what we perceive to be an acceptable standard of living. Mm-hmm. And the propaganda is really amazing. Should we all just accept rolling blackouts in the name of climate change? If you just look at some of the focus panel titles at this conference, I'll read them to you. Unlocking a just and sustainable economy through universal basic services. That sounds an awful lot like communism to me. Yeah. Cutting the addiction of labor to growth, the 4 days week. And then my particular favorite is from the welfare state to the socio-ecological state, how to organize and finance welfare without growth. It's like, yeah, if you're not growing and you have no money, it's probably hard to give it to people and have them not work. It's really amazing. And that's why we call the piece, green is the new red, because ultimately this is on the path to sort of this Maoist, Stalinist, centralized, controlled, great, giant leap forward, whatever you want to call it, type mindset that we thought we had rid ourselves of. And yet here we are. But this is truly, by the way, the luxury of the rich, right? I mean, how many poor countries in the world would kill to have the stability of the grid that we've been able to eke out in spite of our best efforts to hoist upon it vast amounts of intermittent and weather-dependent renewables. And so we do believe that the on the path from a great standard of living to a poor one is political upheaval, and the current slate of Western leaders seems hell-bent on proving that once again.
Well, when you mentioned that, the last title there, what was it? Organizing welfare without growth. That makes me curious. I actually kind of want to go see that because, in some ways, the previous, let's say, 40, 50 years of monetary expansion that we've seen leads to a conclusion that MMT probably would work in that situation, as the track record of it has been somewhat unblemished if you look in that one particular corner, ignoring inflation, ignoring all these other constraints.
Well, the good news is the complete recording of that session is available. I will DM you the link after we're done recording. And if you could get through I'll put the over under on 9 minutes of how much you'll be able to watch of that particular session, because we didn't make it that far. It truly is. It almost like, again, maybe it says more about me than it does about them, but I felt like I was watching aliens talking about a world about which I have no knowledge. Mm-hmm. It's certainly, for example, nothing like the types of messages that we have tried to impart to our children as we raise them into what we hope will be responsible, self-sufficient adults. Mm-hmm. The entire concept of what they imagine the government's role in our lives should be is so incongruent with at least the American way. I'm sure it's similar, at least in parts of Canada. Perhaps the major, urban centers might have a bit of sympathy towards such views. But I think if you cross the Great Plains out west, many people would find such concepts abhorrent. But it's just really amazing how mainstream this has become in Europe. And Europe is really the testing ground for so many of these things. In many ways, they're 4 or 5 years ahead of California and New England. And what begins to happen in Europe, you can predict will eventually get rolled out here, starting in those 2 regions in the US. And we're starting to see it here, accepting rolling blackouts. Maybe we shouldn't pursue growth. How much is enough? And so on and so on. And it is a disturbing trend. And I do think it will provoke a serious political backlash if it does spread here in North America.
Mm-hmm. So, Doomberg, why do you think there's still such a resistance to nuclear energy? Do you think it's mostly, let's say, old thought patterns that are still at work, or do you think that there are still active smear campaigns from other industries underway?
Oh, there's a huge smear campaign underway. We wrote a piece just this morning, frame of reference, where we walk through the facts of, the dangers of radiation and civilian nuclear power versus military grade nuclear weapons, and how the two are knowingly conflated, even though they are worlds apart in risk profile. The entire lunacy around this Fukushima water, quote unquote, release couldn't be a better example of just how we've lost the plot. How utterly unscientific and truly, I think, destructive for society such such propaganda levied against the industry has become. And just last night, Tulsi Gabbard put out this really amazing tweet, which is just, she should be embarrassed by it, in our view. Basically saying that, well, we're going to poison the entire Pacific Ocean by releasing what is essentially clean enough water to swim in. For sure, I would swim in that water. This is the most heavily treated and safest water on the planet, and still the plan is to release it with 100-to-1 dilution over a period of 30 years. And as we said in the piece, you're talking about 1.1 million cubic meters, and the Pacific Ocean is 714 quadrillion cubic meters. 1 part per quadrillion. Last I checked, you could drink just about anything at 1 part per quadrillion. And so people just lose all sense of proportionality when they talk about nuclear. And this is, of course, as a result of the Malthusian anti-nuclear movement from the 60s and 70s that has done, to its credit, an enormously effective job at slandering the industry, an industry that has done more to enable the flourishment of humanity than almost any other sector. It has a near perfect safety record. We talk in the piece, we open frame of reference with the story of a major dam collapse in China in the 70s, and it's estimated that a 250,000 people may have died from this catastrophe, which arose from Typhoon Nina. And could you imagine if a nuclear plant had melted down and 250,000 people would have died? There would be no more nuclear around the world, that's for sure. And yet, the world isn't going about the task of deconstructing all of our hydroelectric dams because a shoddily constructed one succumbed to a 1,000-year rainfall event in China. Millions of people in North America live within flooding distance of the flooding radius of a hydroelectric dam. Practically the entire province of Quebec is one giant hydroelectric dam. We are capable in all other primary energy analyses of measuring risks, hedging tails, and going about living our lives, except for nuclear. For some reason, nuclear energy is treated so differently. As we said in the piece, there is no risk too small to amplify beyond all plausible proportion, and no benefit too large to minimize into irrelevancy. We've just got our head in the sand on nuclear, and hopefully we are beginning to fight back in the propaganda battle. The platform we have, doing our small part, others like Mark Nelson and Chris Kiefer at Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and a whole army of online Twitter accounts that exist to set the record straight. But it is a losing battle so far, but it's one worth fighting.
Yeah, thinking about Tulsi's tweet there, it really anything to do with nuclear seems absolutely radioactive, pun intended.
Yeah.
And it just seems that there's no accountability to actually try to understand the science behind it. And that's, again, why I appreciate, being able to have these conversations. And in a similar vein to that, I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday, and the guest was a publicist of RFK. And it was brought up that he doesn't really believe that nuclear was a safe path forward for the future, but did add that he was open to having his mind changed on the matter. So how would you pitch nuclear energy to a presidential candidate that was, let's say, mildly opposed to the idea?
Yeah, it's interesting. You should ask that, because Mark Nelson and I have been contemplating writing an open letter to Kennedy on this exact topic, and we'll see if it ever gets done. But I would start by saying energy is life. 2, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. 3, to articulate a proper energy strategy, one must consider both, the positives and the trade-offs. And when you perform a level-headed, science-based assessment of nuclear energy versus all the other forms of primary power available to us, it is just undeniable that it emerges as the option that has the most prolific suite of benefits for society with the least amount of risk. And the industry has been so beaten by regulators that it is, in fact, amongst the safest occupations on the planet. working at a nuclear power plant. I would love nothing more than for my neighborhood to get a nuclear reactor, because I know that our power would be cheap and plentiful for the rest of our lives, and I would live right next door to it. There is no risk-free living. We don't drive to work in tanks. Millions of people die in car accidents every year. We just accept that as a cost of this amazing freedom to go where we want, when we want. There are some risks, there are some trade-offs, and when you do that measurement, and if a politician were genuinely sincere in their desire to do so, the facts are just undeniable, and virtually all of the criticisms of nuclear energy are wildly out of proportion to reality, made by propagandists who have agendas beyond discovering what the best source of primary energy for society should be.
You bring up the idea of cheap, reliable power. And for somebody that is so concerned about the middle class and what's happening to the middle class, you'd think that would be an excellent place to start with a vision of the future forward for the ability for let's say the middle class to be able to have, as I said, cheap, reliable power.
So I should say there is a large Western developed world grid with a leadership team that is doing exactly that. And we wrote about it last week in a piece called Cheat Codes. And that region is the province of Ontario. And the leader is Doug Ford. The party name, which would sound like an oxymoron here in the US, Progressive Conservatives, have done exactly that. And they've put out a thoughtful 85-page plan. They've reconciled with physics. They have embarked on a nuclear renaissance. The province, as you know, I'm sure, already has one of the greenest, most reliable, least carbon intense grid in the world, and they intend to make the investments today to pass on that privilege to the next generation of Ontarians over the decades ahead. And we should praise politicians when they embark on a return to sanity. And I frankly don't know much about the rest of Doug Ford's politics because I don't follow Ontario provincial politics all that closely, but as measured by his energy policy, he gets an A+ from the team here at Doomberg.
Mm-hmm. I don't follow it very closely either, but it's interesting, as you brought up in the piece, that they scored that victory in that election very much based around those energy policies, right?
Yeah, so we opened the piece with the story of the now infamous Green Energy Act of Ontario in 2009, and how essentially that basically became a giant grift and mismanagement and taxpayer waste project. And the estimates are that somewhere around 60 billion Canadian of Ontario taxpayer money will have been torched in an inferno of corruption, as we said in the piece. And to calibrate any U.S. listeners, that's roughly the equivalent of the U.S. wasting $1 trillion on a per capita basis. And that's probably going to be what we're going to waste by the time the entirety of the Inflation Reduction Act has run its course. And the reason why we called the piece Cheat Codes, and in the social preview to the piece, we said, Ontario is basically a decade ahead of the U.S. in its energy journey. Let's skip the in-between. Like, why don't we just go to where the answer is? Mm-hmm. The answer is very clear. By the way, nothing about the physics of energy changed in Ontario, only its politics did. And as you correctly pointed out, and we described in the piece, the complete and total wipeout of the ruling Liberal Party in the 2018 election was historic. It was their worst turnout, their worst sort of voting tally seats won in their 161-year history. In fact, I believe they didn't even win enough seats to claim official party status. And to Doug Ford's credit, among the first acts they did was a complete repeal of the Green Energy Act, and they have replaced it with the current energy strategy. Let's hope that the politicians that follow this administration, whatever party, see the fallacy of the prior attempt and the wisdom of the new one. Mm-hmm. And hopefully that's the case. And as we described in the piece, from new large reactors to increased installations of SMRs to refurbishing Pickering, and Canada has the workforce, it has the assets, it has the technology, it has the know-how. These create great union jobs. It's a real win-win, and it's really great to see, Ontario, which is truly the exception that proves the rule here.
Well, you bring up that that as an exception to the rule. I mean that's a perfect way to put it. And just as an aside, the idea that a conservative type party won in a place that is very left leaning, like Ontario, is a huge deal that shouldn't be overlooked either. But you brought up exactly the point that I wanted to get to. They are the exception to the rule. So when we think about the other side of that, could the rest of the world that is still, under this, I don't want to call it under an illusion, but a different view of the world, could we be at the start of a self-inflicted pain learning curve with the reality of renewables?
So if you step back and you do an agnostic assessment of the politics, we are seeing around the world, with the exception of Germany, a complete renaissance of attitude towards nuclear power, and this is probably only going to grow as the last of the Malthusians, the hippies from the 60s eventually make their way off the stage and are replaced by people who have an authentic desire to execute a decarbonization of the economy to the best of our ability. Even in the US, the people are starting to come to their senses. Germany is the last holdout. Our friend, again, Mark Nelson, who I mentioned a couple times now, recently put out a report that as many as 8 of the German nuclear reactors, in fact, could plausibly be brought back online with relatively small investments and dedicated effort from a new government. And the polls in Germany are indicating that the population is beginning to shift. And one of the things, again, in the seminar that we're working on for this week, the total complacency in Europe. We had an extraordinarily warm winter, which bailed out the region. I would note, and we do in this presentation, that March of 2023 marked the official end of a 3-year La Nina event. And as we are consistently told on Twitter now, we are in the middle of an El Nino, which is, of course, driving sort of warmer temperatures in certain parts of the ocean and so on. If you look historically, La Ninas tend to lead to unseasonably warm winters in Western Europe, but El Ninos lead to the reverse. And so if we are truly in the midst of a strong El Nino climate event, it's plausible that the upcoming winter, contrary to being a warmer than average one, might be a colder than average one. And having completely shut down all of its nuclear power plants, we're not quite sure what the Germans will do in the middle of the doldrums if it's 20, 30, 40 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it was last winter at the extremes. And so we shall see. We hope, we're certainly not wishing ill will upon anybody to prove a point, but we would just caution that we certainly are at peak complacency, and we had warned, do not allow good luck to be confused with sound strategy. They made it through the winter because of the whims of Gaia, but it seems as though they are not listening to that advice, and so we're going to roll the dice once again. But the market, the consensus view is that the preparations from last winter were more than enough, and so will be the preparations for this winter. And we would just point out, let's see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, you brought up the point that they had an unseasonably mild winter last year. And you and I spoke about the idea that the inventory levels of their gas reserves, while they can stock them up, don't necessarily last them, through the winter, right?
Well, there's 2 measurements. There's the average that you would need over a winter, and then there's the maximum rate at which you can remove natural gas from storage. Now, to be fair, and of course, this should come as a surprise to nobody, a massive amount of investment has gone into natural gas infrastructure, which makes old assumptions and models far less useful on a go-forward basis. And so it's entirely possible that such planning has been executed and will be enough. We would just point out that that the luck factor of last winter seems to have been completely ignored. And as anybody who's had any sort of life experience knows, that if your base case is continuing good luck, the world seems to have a way of rebounding upon you the reality of the role of a die. And so we shall see.
You brought up earlier the death of the wind industry. What were some of the, let's say, the high level parts of that really makes sense to bring to people's attention?
At the highest level, we believe that the industry has made a couple of fatal errors. First, it has chased, in the name of efficiency, ever longer blade length in the hopes of bringing down costs. But unfortunately, given the forces at work, while you have increased efficiency on paper, the balance of stress that is imposed upon all of the other parts of a wind turbine are causing much, much higher failure rates in the field than had been modeled. And what we're seeing now is unanticipated liabilities making their way from the field to the balance sheets of these companies. We are seeing companies walk away from projects because the rates that were approved for the acquisition of the power that these turbines would create can no longer cover the costs of the developers, which, by the way, and we point out, is a complete exposure of the fraud of the concept of levelized cost of electricity. Because if you were to believe proponents of such illogical measurements, wind should be the cheapest energy in the world. And we have pointed out that if it were, it wouldn't require so many subsidies, and somebody in the value chain would be making some money. Wherever you look, people lose money on wind projects. And so we believe, or making an early call, we're pretty early with our pattern recognition sometime, that green energy, within the green energy suite of options available, wind is going to fall off the cliff as a suitable one, especially offshore. These blades have become so long and so unwieldy that it's been a huge challenge. Now you take that's the big mistake number one. Big mistake number two is the industry has not settled on any standardization. And so the proliferation of various designs, lengths, and techniques, and so on, has not allowed for the supply chain to harmonize and to benefit from economies of scale in the way that, a solar panel is pretty standard. Everybody understands that you go through, polysilicon to ultimately through wafers, and then you mount them as cells, and so on and so on. And there's some pretty standard, like cutting fluids, and pick your favorite other technologies that are as we convert ignits into wafers. These are all kind of worked out and standardized and do benefit from scale. Very little in the wind sector because of this heterogeneity. Each project is almost bespoke, and they're experimenting in real time, holding very few variables constant, which is kind of unscientific. To the point where I think they've gotten ahead of their skis. Mm-hmm. And we do think we're seeing signs of serious crack up. The Siemens Energy fiasco is just one, we think, the tip of the iceberg of what's to come. You combine that with growing local opposition to these eyesores, and we do think that amongst the renewable options available, wind energy is set for a steep decline, in our view.
So to be fair and to acknowledge the other side of that, where do and what renewables do you think makes sense at this point?
So it's a great question. We have spent years in the solar industry, and we have a soft spot for solar, predominantly because the sheer amount of energy that the sun bombards the earth with every day is this tantalizing goal that if we could figure out, the challenges of intermittency or how to more effectively harness that energy, it truly would be a limitless supply of useful work. And the other thing about solar is it's, for certain, for example, that you're never going to get energy from it at night. And so it's a bit more predictable. Mm-hmm. There are regions of the world where the capacity factors make it pretty interesting. So that, the sun belt of the US, for example, but as a solution in Germany, which has the, incidence rate of Maine and goes weeks in the winter with barely any sunlight, it's amongst the dumbest things you could have done. And I think that actually is a stain on the solar industry. If you pressed us to prioritize, we would say solar first, wind a deep second, and then biomass a laughable third. There's just no scenario where burning wood, you can't convince us that burning wood, no matter how you came across that wood, makes any sense for the environment.
Well, we call it biomass, so it makes it much better.
It's
and greener.
You couldn't make it up.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's possible that we get to a point of such a diminishment in oil supply, let's say, that it would make building out a reasonable nuclear fleet around the world cost prohibitive because of the cost of oil? And could we miss that window of being able to mine the materials and assemble the plants before that energy cliff comes?
No, the energy payback for nuclear is amazing. The best calculations we've seen on the matter is that it takes about 6 weeks for a nuclear energy plant to pay back the total amount of energy that went into its construction. Compared to all the other energy sources, this is a huge advantage. Mm-hmm. It takes years and years for solar and wind to pay back that same energy. And in fact, the Substack public just came out with a damning expose on how the energy embedded in the production of solar panels has been essentially fabricated because nobody has line of sight to reliable data in China, and China dominates the market. And we've always known, and we have said and argued, that the production of solar-grade polysilicon is basically the most energy-intense industrial process known to humankind. There's no way that this pays back in any reasonable time. Anybody with any sense of physics knows that just intuitively. In the state of Michigan, for example, by far the biggest customer for electricity is an outfit called Hemlock Semiconductor, a private producer of polysilicon. And having visited that facility, I can assure you that you can literally feel the volume of energy being consumed in that process as you tour it. And so among the options we have, nuclear with its very quick energy payback period there's no scenario where we won't be able to implement it. And to be totally honest, we are skeptical of sort of peak oil theories to begin with. At the right price, there's plenty of fossil fuels for a very long time.
Last year, I remember the German energy minister visiting Canada and asking Trudeau to help supply them with more natural gas. And in response, he did not offer any natural gas to them, but offered a plan to start implementing and start shipping hydrogen in many years. Do you think that hydrogen, the fuel cycle of hydrogen, ends up in that same category of being more energy intensive than what it actually ends up putting out?
So again, this is an example of a politician who has no concept of physics or science whatsoever. We wrote about this. I'm pulling it up as we talk, but this is amongst the craziest ideas. So the concept is we're going to build wind turbines off the coast of Newfoundland. We're going to transmit the electricity generated to the shores, where we're going to take that energy, create hydrogen through electrolysis, presumably. Then we're going to take that hydrogen and run it through the Haber process to produce ammonia. Such plants don't exist in Newfoundland, of course. And we're going to then load that ammonia onto ships, because as hard as it is to ship ammonia, it's marginally easier, i.e. possible, when compared to the difficulties or near impossibility of shipping hydrogen. Then we're going to take that ammonia and we're going to put it on a boat, powered by diesel, presumably, and we're going to transport it all the way to Germany, where it'll be offloaded and then burned in some way to release energy. And the piece we wrote in October describing this Rube Goldberg machine, it was called Chicken's Razor. And the opening story, of course, is that exact meaning that you referenced. And in that piece, we proposed a far simpler solution. Germany is in possession of a plethora of ammonia reactors. It is also in possession of nuclear power plants that have recently been shuttered. Why don't you start up the nuclear power plant, make hydrogen locally, and make ammonia from nuclear-powered hydrogen, pink hydrogen as it's called? Why would you go through all of the other steps when you could just do it right there? And that's, Chicken's Razor is a play on Occam's razor. They have all the tools they need. And by the way, that would be a really interesting project. It would allow companies like Siemens to demonstrate their electrolysis technology at scale. The world could certainly use more fertilizer. The ammonia plants in Germany are disadvantaged because of the natural gas arbitrage that is still there. It's much cheaper to produce ammonia in North America because natural gas is cheap than it is in Europe. So you have these uncompetitive ammonia plants and idled nuclear power plants. Why don't you just skip all the steps in between and do it right there in Germany and prove out the concept? Hydrogen, in the way Trudeau and Germany are proposing to create and ship it makes no sense. In a world where energy is abundant and free, hydrogen can be a pretty effective carrier of energy. Hydrogen is not a source of energy. It needs to be synthesized, and then you exploit it. The energy that creates that hydrogen has to come from somewhere. We could imagine a fleet of nuclear power reactors running electrolyzers and then burning that hydrogen in internal combustion engine cars. All those technologies exist. It would be a wonderful carbon-free way to solve our transportation impact on the planet. We would be all for that. But again, along the same lines of how stupid it is to install solar in Germany, and therefore the poor performance of solar in Germany is a stain on the industry, this crazy idea will take will definitely hurt the brand of hydrogen as a potential energy tool in our suite for the future.
Yeah, it reminds me of the discussion that we had last time about heat pumps and complicating this energy process and what that ultimately means for that entire, energy generation equation.
It's funny you should bring that up because I saw an amazing model the other day. One of the reasons why the far right party in Germany is on the ascent and the Greens' popularity is collapsing is because of this mandate for people to replace their furnaces with heat pumps. And one of the interesting stats that we saw was that almost no homes in Germany have air conditioning. And through the forced installation of heat pumps, millions of homes will now have air conditioning, and they're very likely to use it in the summer. And so the net energy saved by the replacement of gas furnaces, which basically can only be used to heat your home in the winter, with heat pumps, which can be used to both heat and cool your home, depending on the season, is going to eventually lead to the outcome of more energy being used than if we had just left well enough alone, which of course is the classic concept of all central planning. And so heat pumps, or pick your favorite electric vehicle, same way. These things tend not to go according to plan, and Germany is about to find out the hard way.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit, Doomberg, and talk about something that is obviously really important to many of our listeners. You recently wrote a piece on the moves and murmurings of the BRICS group of nations and what the outcomes of them announcing a gold-backed trading currency of some sort that could possibly come with this announcement later in August here. So does this change the way that you think or look at gold and its role in a portfolio?
So I'll start with what is the sort of our view of the is state and the likelihood. We wrote a piece called Something or Nothing, where in fact for the first time that we've actually done this, we decided to just canvass 5 experts who study this problem much closer than we do. And we from Luke Groman to Brent Johnson to Grant Williams to Mike Green, and then the anonymous author at Concoda Research, and we solicited their inputs, and they kind of mostly agreed on things. And our view is pretty simple. Gold is not our vehicle for speculation. The 3 pillars of our financial strategy is we earn money in fiat, we save by buying real assets like gold and land and collectibles, and then we invest privately where we have some impact on the outcome. And in that context, gold is just a vehicle for us to save excess earnings in a way that we believe will preserve our purchasing power over the long term. We don't speculate on gold, and what the price of gold is on a day-to-day basis isn't particularly interesting to us. And we would say that the experts sort of agreed on the following: displacing the U.S. dollar system will be hard and take longer than many think. Lots of countries would like to do so, understandably. The seizing of Russia's assets has only increased the motivation for such countries to try, and the ultimate impact on the price of gold and oil and the U.S. dollar compared to other currencies, in the unlikely event that such an effort succeeds, is incredibly challenging to model. And so we close the piece by saying, one of our bedrock philosophies of prudence is when in doubt, do nothing. And aside from keeping an eye on this for our own intellectual curiosity and for interesting things to write about, that's certainly what we intend to do. Gold is an important aspect of our personal wealth preservation strategy. If we wake up tomorrow and gold is repriced $500 an ounce higher, I suppose that's good in the narrow assessment of the part of our balance sheet that holds that gold. but it probably doesn't bode well for the balance of our balance sheet that is tied to the US dollar, because that's the system that we live and operate in. So kind of agnostic either way, but it is very interesting, and we shall see. Very much looking forward to what comes out of the meeting in August, like everybody else.
Yeah, I think it will be really interesting, yet not be this slam dunk or this step change for the US dollar from the conversations that I've had. But this kind of brings up a larger point that I want to get your thoughts on. How do you see your role within the spaces that you and I have spoken about in all of our discussions? Are you trying to contribute to the discussion of many of these big topics? And what do you see as the risks of being labeled as spreading misinformation and its possible consequences?
Our role is look, we're professional content creators, and so our role is to research, understand, and articulate our views on complex topics. And we try our best to be, provocative without being polarizing. I would say the only area where we are potentially running risk of censorship / disinformation is on our work around our response to climate change. The trend in that area is to clamp down on even the most thoughtful, fact-based, politely articulated views. You're just not allowed to have certain views in that area. Luckily for us, so far, Substack has been a very strong supporter of the concept of free speech. And we do believe that we since we show all of our work, i.e. link to all of our pieces that we use as references and quote from in the pieces that we write, and that we politely express those views and are willing to engage in polite debate with anybody, that perhaps we will be spared the wrath of the censorship industrial complex, as our friend Michael Schellenberger calls it. But we're also prepared for that inevitability. Ultimately, you have to express your authentically held views. That's our God-given right as U.S. citizens, and we intend to continue to exercise those rights and fight for them to the extent that we can. But the trend is certainly not a positive one. It's something we've written about. This is why we were so outraged by the debanking of Nigel Farage, regardless of your views of his political stances. If this precedent is allowed to stand, and as the title of the piece we wrote on the matter suggests, quote, "You're next." And there's a line in the sand that everybody has to draw. And so our role is we create content. People seem to like it. We try to delight our readers. We work for our subscribers. This is why, of course, we don't accept advertising and sponsorship, because far easier to put pressure on a point source of revenue like that, as opposed to the thousands of paying subscribers that we have. It's hard to cancel all of them.
So, you kind of brought up in a recent conversation that maybe having a second passport and being willing and able to use it is the ultimate step in a fight against becoming an unperson or being unbanked, as you called it before. So do you think that is the ultimate step that you're going to need if anybody runs afoul of these, being financially censored, as Nigel Farage was?
I actually brought that up in the context of almost nobody has that option. Mm-hmm. And so you actually have to stick around and fight it out here. I have no intent in leaving the US. I would rather participate in the political process that, in our own small way, at least tries to stop such encroachment on our liberties. Because I have no intent of getting a passport and uprooting my family. I love this country. I've got roots here. My children hopefully will thrive here. Our friends, our family, our business associates. This is home. But if you did have a second passport, that many of the Bitcoin maxis talk to us as though that they could persist in a country that outlawed Bitcoin. I was like, well, only if you're willing to leave it. If you can't spend it, then you're not going to be able to do much with it, except port it either to the new regime that comes into your existing country or to another country if you're willing to move. Very few people have that option. And frankly, nor should we force them into having to choose between staying in the country where they currently reside. And so, yes, for many, like Nigel Farage has basically said he will leave the UK. That's not an option for the plumber who lost his or her bank account because they accept too much in the way of cash payment. And so, if it comes to that, we've got bigger problems to worry about.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the ideas that I wanted to talk about with you a little bit, that if crypto solves that problem, as you said, it's always told that Bitcoin or any other number of cryptos can be used to transact, whether that's off chain or, any other ways that they present. But do you think that crypto solves that problem of, if you have your banks close your accounts, what other ways are there to really transact?
Well, we wrote a piece in the aftermath of the crackdown on the Canadian truckers called "What Canada Means for Crypto." And unfortunately, it's the same for what it means for gold. Like, if my bank accounts are closed, I can't buy groceries. Last I checked, the major supermarkets do not accept Bitcoin. I suppose you could, or gold, right? You need to have the fiat payment rails, and the government controls that. It's unfortunate. I would love nothing better for Bitcoin to be a solution to such challenges. And if it actually were, we would be major owners of it. It doesn't. Trudeau and the provincial government of Ontario ordered the freezing of various crypto wallets. And guess what? The financial institutions of Canada complied. If the US made a law tomorrow that said transacting in Bitcoin is illegal, 99.99% of businesses wouldn't think twice about it, because they don't transact in Bitcoin today, but they certainly wouldn't embark on taking Bitcoin from somebody who's been canceled. Look at how difficult it has been for Nigel Farage to get an account outside of Coutts. He's been turned down, I think, 11 times. Once you've been labeled an unperson by the government, no institution, you're not worth it. Your business is not worth the risk of a regulatory crackdown to that owner. And so we have said, much to the chagrin of people in the Bitcoin community, with whom we actually agree a lot on and have a good relationship with many of them, that what is presented before us today is not a currency problem. It is a political problem. And therefore, a new currency won't solve the political problem. We have to solve the politics. It should be politically unacceptable that unelected regulators whisper in the ears of banking CEOs who owe their entire business to the whims of the government, saying, you probably shouldn't pick your favorite crypto influencer to have a bank account, because we've decided we want to crack down on the crypto sector. We've written in defense of the crypto sector and against the tactics being used to roll up that industry. And we've even written how those exact same tactics could be used against gold owners in a piece called Gold in Handcuffs. These should scare everybody, crypto and non-crypto alike. But Bitcoin is not a solution to this problem, because the government could just outlaw it and everybody who matters would listen.
And I mean, on that topic, the accusations that were levied against Farage were baseless, I believe, right?
Well, they were. What has since come out since we wrote that piece is a 40-page dossier that the bank wrote on him for internal consumption. That was nothing more than a collection of his political views. And in fact, they leaked his financial information to the BBC, which is itself is a huge scandal. It just shows the lengths to which they were willing to go to punish a political enemy. And if that doesn't scare you, the thing that amazes me is most people fall into two camps. One, that's never going to happen to me, so I don't care about it. Or two, that person's not on my team. Let's punish them. As though the other side might not ever regain power and decide to take a little revenge on you. Like you have to have a consistent ideology that is resistant to partisan forces here. Like, I don't care what Nigel Farage's political positions are. The more I hate them, the stronger I should defend his right to have a bank account, or at least have the charges and the wrongdoings he stands accused of be presented to him so he could defend himself. This is craziness. We have turned centuries of Western jurisprudence on its head. The concept of innocent until proven guilty dates all the way back to the Magna Carta. Are we just going to flippantly toss it aside to score cheap political points against an opponent, that we don't like? it's insane how quickly many are willing to either ignore the loss of fundamental freedoms or are cheering it on because they are blindly captured by this narrative of team sport politics. If they were canceling members of Greenpeace's bank accounts because they didn't like their stance against nuclear energy, we would be the first to write how outrageous that was, even though we think Greenpeace's stance on nuclear energy is among the dumbest that could possibly exist. They should still have a bank account. Holding a dumb opinion on nuclear power is not an offense. Even being deceptive about why you believe it, free speech is free speech. Either it is or it isn't. And if we don't have it, we don't really have freedom.
I wanted to get your take on kind of this intersection between obviously crypto, which is something we've talked about, and energy. The argument is often made that crypto miners are a good use of excess power on grids during, let's say, non-peak hours, or using energy that is generated in remote areas that would otherwise go up a flare stack or otherwise wasted. So what do you see the constraints to this argument?
So first, we concur with it broadly. We've written to that effect. And second, I would say the big constraints is, again, the environmental movement will just simply not allow this to happen. So the argument, which again proves that we're willing to look at an issue with sort of an open mind, the argument goes like this: especially with the forced introduction of intermittent renewables, there are times in large parts of the country where the price of electricity goes negative, where these renewable sources overload the grid with too much electricity, and in order to shed, they pay people to take it. The piece that we wrote on this back in November is called "A Fine Mess," and the social preview was something to the effect of, the grid is no place for innovative companies, because what we're seeing is a political backlash driven by the environmentalists who don't want to allow peaking plants to exist. So, for example, a great application for Bitcoin mining is because of we've forced all this intermittent renewables onto the grid. When the renewables don't show up, you need to call upon what are known as peaking power plants to make up the difference. So a natural gas plant, for example, that only exists to shave off the high end of demand. Well, nobody's ever going to build that plant because it makes no sense from an economic perspective. But if you give them something else they could do, i.e. mine for Bitcoin and sell the Bitcoin and generate some value during the downtime, it might make the viability of a peaking plant more reasonable, and therefore it might allow for further introduction of renewables into the grid. This is just facts. And so we wrote that piece called "A Fine Mess." And, the Bitcoin maxis certainly didn't mind that we wrote that piece, but it's consistent with our sort of ideology, as I said before. Whatever your views are on the value of Bitcoin and the appropriateness of using energy resources to mine for it, it's simply undeniable that many people around the world do place significant value in Bitcoin, and mining for Bitcoin can be a profitable exercise in the right conditions. One of those conditions is where you have excess energy, energy that you don't know what to do with, energy that you have to flare. So instead of flaring it, maybe you spin a turbine with it and mine Bitcoin, which enables, in the Permian, the incremental production of oil that the Biden administration so desperately needs. And so, again, these things are complex, and it's important to sort of cut through the propaganda. But the biggest barrier to this is the, Elizabeth Warrens of the world and the environmental movements who view the combusting of fossil fuels in any circumstances as the work of the devil. And then combusting fossil fuels to create a cryptocurrency is just a bridge too far for them. And they have significant power, and they've decided to use it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Doomberg, we're kind of coming up against time here, but I wanted to ask you a bonus question, which is something new here. I want to get your take on an interesting headline that I recently saw here. And that is underground climate change deforming the ground beneath buildings, as CNN recently reported? Or is this just another example of a ridiculous and inconvenient to falsify narrative that is being pushed?
Yeah, this falls under the category that if everything is climate change, nothing is. And such headlines actually do a disservice to serious environmentalists who are genuinely concerned about the state of the environment and how we will leave it for our children. And we share those concerns. We may have
That's
different...
a great way to put it.
Yeah, we may have different views on how best to get from here to there, or how serious a certain alarmism might actually be. But headlines like this help nobody. It causes significant parts of the population to just shut their brain off completely from the entire fight. I don't think any serious environmentalists would look at that headline and think it's a good thing. Chalk it up to the thing that we talked about earlier, which is sort of the need for clickbait and the need to draw eyeballs, because it's such a stupid headline, let's call it what it is, that even people who know it to be stupid will click on it just to see how dumb it is, and to see the logical fallacies that must have been applied to generate such a headline from the fact that the ground is shifting. If everything is climate change, nothing is. And this does nobody any good.
Mm-hmm. Well, Doomberg, I want to thank you for an excellent conversation as always. Of course, all of your work is available on your Substack, doomberg.substack.com. And of course, you're a great Twitter follow at DoombergT, right?
You bet, Tom. And I, again, always love talking to you. What a pleasure to be able to do so while not in the throes of a crisis. But if another crisis does arise, you know our email.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Tom.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.